Aaron Adams. I'm Director of Science and Conservation for Bonefish Tarpon Trust. We're a U.S.-based organization that works in the Western Hemisphere throughout the Caribbean. Our focal species are bonefish, tarpon, and permit. We're adding more species, snook, redfish, essentially recreationally targeted species that use shallow coastal habitats. But our overall approach is a habitat-focused one, similar to Ozfish. If you have good habitats, you can have good fisheries. If any of you saw my talk yesterday, we actually have fisheries that are really well managed from a management perspective, as far as harvest regulations and everything, but the populations are declining entirely because of habitat and water quality declines. There's actually one fishery, one region, the entire east side of Florida, where our redfish fishery is now catch and release only, which is advocated for by anglers because of habitat and water quality issues. So what we want to talk about today is, I should also say, Craig Copeland, of course, is my partner in this effort, trying to figure out a way to create a new paradigm to incorporate habitat into recreational fisheries management. Right? And I'll go through some stuff that's going to be the Captain Obvious type of stuff to everybody in the room, but we have to figure out a way to get out of the box that we're in now with stock assessment-based stuff and bring in some habitat components. So at Bonefish Tarpon Trust, we're very influenced by colleagues in the terrestrial conservation world, where they start with a habitat as their foundation and then work up to the species level. And they do so in what we would call an actionable knowledge level of information, where they don't know anything, but they seem to be more comfortable with uncertainty than we do in the marine world. So to move on with that, the first thing I would say, the current status of fishery management is we have a lot of silos. So, and there's not a lot of integration, communication between these silos. And I'll use Florida, where we're based, as an example, because we work with the Fisheries Management Agency there a lot. On the one hand, you have the silo of your typical stock assessment approach. So we'll work with the stock assessment biologists, using all that information that we have there. One of the challenges we have for the fisheries that we focus on, which are almost entirely catch and release, is we don't have a stock assessment. We don't have any age structure estimations. We don't have any abundance estimations. So how can you manage those fisheries from a stock assessment perspective? You can't. And so the state right now assumes that since they're catch and release, they don't need any management. But every single one of the species that we work on is in decline in the state of Florida. And again, it's because of the habitat issues. On the other side, what we work on, what Craig works on, is the habitat, the fish's perspective of habitat. You need good habitat, you need good water quality in order to have abundant fish populations. That silo doesn't integrate very well with the stock assessment side. And in Florida, as with most or many fisheries management agencies, they have a fish biology and a fish habitat section that doesn't interact much with the stock assessment section, which doesn't interact well with the Division of Marine Fisheries Management. So there's those kinds of silos. And then the third silo, which is great to see at this conference, there's a lot of integration with the research side and somewhat the management side, is the recreational fisheries or stakeholders. It's great to see the recent or the newly released economic valuation study here in Australia. We use that tool a lot in our area, and it provides us leverage. So even for species that we don't have any stock assessments for, we're able to get spatial management, like seasonal closures or spawning area closures, because of the economics. There's a lot of cultural value. It's great to see the indigenous cultural application here. We work on some of that in the Caribbean as well. So part of what we have to do is figure out how to integrate those silos, and that's going to create need a new paradigm. What NOAA, and unfortunately I don't see any of the guys in the room, is doing right now with some of their ecosystem-based management is they're trying to put habitat data into the stock assessment model. And that's kind of a square peg in a round hole type of issue. But the stock assessment model just isn't made to incorporate that type of habitat information. So I'm going to run through a few case studies. As I mentioned, a big species for us is snook, which is similar to the barramundi. Quickly on the life history, we know a lot about them. So for us, it's a good species to focus on this conceptual model for a new paradigm. We know where they spawn, which is at inlets on the dropping tide at dusk in the summer, rainy season. The rainy season is important because as the larvae come in, they come into flooded wetlands. A lot of times they're ephemerally connected. You can see the younger life stages there. This is an estuary in southwest Florida. The The juveniles depend on backwater mangrove creeks. If you don't have those, you don't have the nursery habitat. Florida's already lost about 50% of these habitats, and that's not being incorporated into management. As I said before, they're tightly regulated, recreational only, for many decades, no commercial harvest. At least half the year is closed for part of the state. Very small slot size for harvest because of the regulations, but also angler ethics changings. This is now 99% of the fish are caught and released. They're not harvested, right? So harvest is not an issue. And they're moving now, we're pushing them into regional management, which is kind of a smaller spatial scales versus the state because of different habitat and water quality challenges around the state. So the official line from FWC, Fish and Wildlife Commission, is that it's a spawning stock is steady. These graphs show a couple different estimates of stock based on catch, and I wouldn't call them very steady. They're very dynamic, some good years, some bad years. Habitat condition, the cool thing is that we're getting some data to show that the amount of habitat available influences the ability of snook to respond to disturbances. So we did a study where we looked at 4 different regions, as you can see here. You can see also in the lower right, this is statewide, the issues that we're confronting. 9 million acres of wetlands are gone, over 2 million acres of seagrass. Freshwater flow has a lot of different arrows because the amount, the quantity, the quality, and location of freshwater flow into estuaries is all over the place. In some places, 20 different creeks have been put into one freshwater flow outlet, and of course, if you know anything about estuary ecology, that just messes everything up. Some of the waters are really clean coming in, but the flows are altered. A lot of nutrients from a lot of different sources called algae blooms, and a lot of contaminants like pharmaceuticals. In the top, you can see those 4 locations are shown, and you can see the different color bars, the amount of habitat loss that has occurred in those different estuaries. So you'll notice the 2 right estuaries, the Indian River Lagoon, had the greatest habitat loss. So when we looked at snook populations, juveniles and subadults, from the top here, Tampa, the relative habitat rating is good, Charles Harbor is good, Southern IRL, Indian River Lagoon is moderate, and the Northern IRL is poor. You can see that we had a cold front right here. We had a big decline because the thermal shock killed about 60% of the snook population in the state. You can see that the recovery of juveniles and even subadults was pretty rapid in the areas with good or moderate, good habitat quality, whereas in moderate and then poor habitat quality, the snook populations either took a longer time to recover or haven't recovered at all after a 10-year period. And so our argument to the state with this is that because of the loss of habitat and the poor water quality, the fisheries that they're managing aren't being sustainable. And they've actually taken this into consideration to try to figure out how to change management. So this is a good example of well-managed fishery, habitat's not included, and they're having issues that they can't address with their current model. Another example is redfish, which I already mentioned. Just very quickly, they spawn offshore. You can see a spawning aggregation here. They have a high return rate to their natal estuary. It's like 85%, right? So if you have an estuary problem, it's regional. It's going to cycle back on you, just like we have, if you guys have heard of our Atlantic cod fishery lack of recovery, that's because of the same type of thing. And you can see the seasonality of spawning. Again, their larvae, over a few weeks, make it back into adjacent to wetland areas. And I already showed you that we've lost 9 million acres of those habitats. The juveniles require those kind of open bottoms adjacent to wetlands for the first couple of years, and our fishery is dependent on subadults. Once they mature, they move out of the estuaries into the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico. So the estuaries are basically supporting the entire fishery. So the current management is recreational only. A larger slot limit. There's no closed season, but they're going to probably change that. The bag limit is down to only one per person per day. And you can see on the right, these are the types of data that the state uses as far as escapement rate, size, abundance estimates, that kind of stuff, but what's not in there, excuse me, is habitat. So what they're doing now is moving into a regional approach, smaller regions. They're using the metrics here, which are attempting to integrate those silos, right? You see stakeholder input. They're doing regular interviews and symposia, getting anglers together, and they're starting to include both habitat trends and I'll call this water quality because of all the nutrients. Have you guys heard of red tide? You hear about our red tide blooms? That's, fortunately, colleagues have done research and shows that the occurrence and frequency, et cetera, of red tide is due to anthropogenic input. So we've kind of crossed that one. But also the same old stuff, escapement, abundance, and then fishing effort. So they're trying to integrate those. So they're making progress, but it's a new effort. We're trying to make things up as we go. Just to give you an idea of some of the stuff they're looking at, this shows seagrass change in the Indian River Lagoon, which I mentioned on the east coast of Florida. And you can see by the color coding there, they're saying it's only a 1% decrease in part of that area, but this is relatively recent. The big die-off of seagrass happened about 12 years ago, and it's 90% less than it was 13 years ago because of harmful algal blooms. You can also see though on the other one, salt marsh change, they have no data within their FWC of how salt marsh has changed. The interesting thing is another agency does have those data, but they're not talking to each other at this point. So that's where groups like BTT and OzFish can kind of come in and communicate. And then third, and correct me if I mess anything up, Craig, is the South Australian red snapper. Again, brief on the life history and spawning inshore waters seasonally, managed as 3 stocks in South Australia. Pretty good larval duration, and again, it's linking the offshore, or excuse me, the coastal waters to the inshore as an estuary. And again, a long duration of dependence on those inshore habitats.
So now, that just brought in, of course, for those of you from Australia know this has occurred, so there's a total closure for the snapper catch in parts of South Australia, and the shared stock with Victoria is now still, I think it's a one fish bag limit. So it's a huge change to the snapper fishery in South Australia.
Yep.
Is it monitored? There's a strong monitoring program in place, and mandatory catch reporting for particularly the southeast where there's a joint, but where you're allowed to, there's mandatory reporting. So.
Great. So again, the key thing is here, stock assessment approach. How many fish are out there? Do we think it's sustainable for spawning? What's not included is habitat condition. So as we show here, over 95% of a pre-existing reef is gone. A large area lost due to the heat wave and also pollution. So basically, trying to manage a fishery based purely on stock assessment when the amount of habitat they need in order to survive and sustain themselves is greatly reduced. Just carrying capacity isn't there. So what we often say in Florida is that, specific to snook, is even if you stopped all harvest of snook, the snook population now is never going to be as big as it was 50, 60 years ago because they've already lost 50% of the juvenile habitat that is the bottleneck for the population. None of that information is incorporated into how we manage the fisheries. Right? We're not talking about the bottleneck. So if I step back, and please correct me if you think I'm going down the wrong path, but if I'm a stock assessment guy, and I had this conversation with a colleague, my friend colleague says, oh yeah, we address all this habitat stuff because then that's what tells us what recruitment is. And I said, well no, that's a big black box. And what's affecting your recruitment could be everything from habitat issues to current dynamics not delivering larvae to disease. There's all kinds of things in that black box. You just know what comes out of it. And the thing is that stock assessment is reactive to what has already happened. And if you have something that's a long-lived fish, like some of the snappers are or tarpon are, by the time you realize that the black box is sending you out not enough recruits, you're 5, 10, in the case of tarpon, 20 years behind and you're reacting to something that's already happened, and you don't even know what that cause is. So what we want to talk about today in a discussion format is how do we create a new paradigm that is able to incorporate habitat into how we manage our fisheries using, as the keynote speaker said, the citizen science to help integrate those different silos. So these are some of the key questions that we talk about today. To what extent is habitat change key to the management of any fishery? So if there's any managers in the room, if habitat changes, if you lose 80,000 acres of seagrass, how does that affect how you manage a fishery, or does it? Or do you just keep looking at the numbers of fish and not address the habitat? How much of habitat change will influence the fishery? That's a pretty tough one to get at, but if we take the conservation biology perspective from the terrestrial world, they have some ballpark estimates of what the habitat changes that cause population changes are. And they don't have the exact answer, but they have a range, and that's how they do a lot of the management. You guys have a lot of terrestrial protected areas here. We do in the States as well. And for example, caribou in Alaska are managed based on habitat first and harvest second. So why can't we do that in the marine world is the big question. What is a habitat-focused complementary approach to stock assessment? We're not talking about replacing stock assessment. We're talking about creating an approach that can complement a stock assessment or inform it. Legislatively, I don't know about in Australia, but in the United States, habitat in our federal Magnuson-Stevens Act, it says habitat must be considered, I put those in quotes, by resource managers. They don't have to include it, they have to consider it. And so it's not included in any of the fisheries that are federally managed. And then of course going back to the silos. So these are the questions that we want to talk about, obviously not solving everything now, but we need to start having these conversations much more seriously before we get too far over some kind of threshold where we can't recover. Like we are for redfish, we're already past that threshold in Florida. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I think there's probably just break into two groups here, this side and that side, just sit around. I don't know how to address this because this is something that we really haven't had a chance to, a space to operate in. This question here is the really interesting one. We're not going to change legislation. Legislation is a really big thing to sort of put a bulldozer under to try and make a change. But I think there is relationships between agencies. So some agencies, as Aaron was saying, hold data, then they're talking to the Fisheries Agency. The Fisheries Agency aren't doing that. So I think if we can have that sort of conversation about how we can manufacture change and what sort of conversations or any other ideas you've got. So maybe we just put into two groups. We've got Aaron, you want to take the one group, I'll take the other, and we'll see if we can't start at least putting some dot points down about how we make a change. Just gather the chairs around.
Right, let's take the chairs in a circle so we can talk to each other.
In front of the thing, right?
Or I'll just